Hey everybody, this is chapter 8 of Existential Marxism in Postwar France, from Sartre to Althusser. Chapter 8 is titled Existential Marxism and Structuralism, and it has two sections. First section is titled Sartre and Structuralism, and section 2 is titled Althusser's Revolution Without Rebels. Okay. Okay, so here we go. Just when existential Marxism emerged, there was an abrupt shift in the French intellectual mood toward structuralism. In this chapter, I will examine structuralism to see where it challenges and where it supplements the positions of Sartre and the Argument group. Taking the viewpoint of existential Marxism, I will test the possibility of a synthesis with structuralism. The discussion will be limited to four major figures: Lévi-Strauss, Lacan, Foucault, and Althusser, who were broadly associated with the new tendency while varying considerably in their interests and concepts. For structuralism was a diffuse tendency, not a neatly consistent doctrine. The unifying thread of the chapter will be the problem of reconciling the two theories about the role of the subject in social thought. Section 1. Sartre and Structuralism. Heading A. Language and Society. Repeating the success of existentialism in the post-war years, the wave of structuralism splashed loudly on Paris in the early 1960s. The man who brought structuralism from the quiet halls of linguistic faculties to the cacophony of the philosophical marketplace was the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. To ensure the victory of structuralism, he felt compelled to challenge Sartre. The final chapter of the book, The Savage Mind, published in 1962, forcefully attacked Sartre's existential Marxism and initiated a new era of controversy that did not abate until May 1968. A contemporary of Sartre, Lévi-Strauss attended the École Normale Supérieure and taught in the Paris lycées with Simone de Beauvoir and Merleau-Ponty. Their destinies began to divide in the mid-1930s. While Sartre traveled to study Husserl and Heidegger, Lévi-Strauss went to the Amazon to do ethnographic research. Like Sartre, the career of Lévi-Strauss was shaped by the war. A Jew, he left France for America, where he met one of the masters of structuralism. His meeting with Roman Jacobson, the phenomenologist at the New School in New York, fixed his future tasks: to apply the insights of structural linguistics to the study of society, specifically to the kinship systems and mythologies of the primitives. While the force of history impressed itself on Sartre in war-torn Europe, Lévi-Strauss immersed himself in the contemplation of timeless structures. To Lévi-Strauss, the new linguistics promised to raise anthropology and the human sciences in general to scientific status. The study of man and culture must become as objective and as certain as the study of nature. The immaturity of the humanistic disciplines, plagued by subjective self-indulgence and cultural myopia, will be replaced by a method that was as cool and precise as mathematics. In linguistics, an epistemological break had occurred before World War I, when Ferdinand de Saussure replaced historical philology with the study of language structures. His book, Course in General Linguistics, compiled from student notes and published after his death, presented a new level of intelligibility of language. Saussure studied la langue, not la parole, not the spoken world but the system of signs. He studied these signs not diachronically in their temporal shifts, but synchronically in their static interrelations and permutations. After the turn of the century, the heyday of evolutionism was over, and many intellectuals strove for ahistorical forms of knowledge. The shift away from the primacy of history was undoubtedly related to the collapse of the belief in progress that had given metaphysical force to the historical study. Isolating the timeless quality of language structure, Saussure ignored the other alternative open at the time: Marxist dialectical history, with great consequences for French structuralism in the 1960s. Saussure developed the principal traits of synchrony, signifiers, roughly words, were opposed to signified, corresponding mental images. Previous language theory concerned itself with the signified, conceiving of language as an expression of thought. Saussure switched the level of concern to the signifier, which could be analyzed formally. Signifiers were intelligible only within their total system. The signifier, quote, cool, is meaningless without the signifier, quote, hot. Hence, language was above all a system or structure, in which the component was secondary to the totality. Meaning was located not in the thoughts of the enunciator, but in the system of signs itself. Jacobson, with his distinction between phonemes, the small units of sound, and morphemes, the smallest unit of meaning, further show that the phonological building blocks of language were an unconscious, quote, meaningless substructure. Later, Hjelmslev developed the formalization of language through primary emphasis on the, quote, combinatory, the rules for combining or relating elements of a system in opposition and correlation. Benveniste's analysis of pronouns revealed that the speaking subject could not be identified with the Cartesian individualist concept of the, quote, I. For every, quote, I invoked the whole system of language, starting with the implied reciprocal, quote, you. In short, structural linguistics made its object intelligible without reference to the subject, the intentional individual. Sartre viewed language in the older way, as a tool for expressing states of consciousness or ideas. What troubled him about language was that it never translated thoughts into words perfectly. Sartre's fascination with words, as documented in his autobiography, turned on his unending struggle to narrow the gap between intention and language. For structural linguistics, Sartre's perspective was futile and incorrect. The intelligibility of language from the perspective of the speaker was entirely secondary to that of its systematic coherence. In contrast to Sartre, language was for Levi-Strauss not an obstacle to truth, but a mechanism that was its own truth. The human mind was manifest not in its intentional statements, but in the hidden structure, the system of binary oppositions that were present to the speaker in his unconsciousness of them. Sartre's all-too-human concern to express himself in language was a laughable inversion of the situation, since language expressed itself through Sartre. The intelligible structure of language is located in a totally unconscious structure. Quote, linguistics, presents us with a dialectical and totalizing entity, but one outside or beneath consciousness and will. Language is an unreflecting totalization, is human reason which has its reasons, and of which man knows nothing, end quote. Levi-Strauss, The Savage Mind. While Sartre wrestled with articulating his meaning in words, Levi-Strauss adopted the scientific advance of linguistics as the unintelligibility of intentionality. In the, quote, phonological revolution, meaning is always the result of a combination of elements which are not themselves significant, In my perspective, meaning is never the primary phenomenon, Behind all meaning there is a non-meaning, end quote. Levi-Strauss. It was this, quote, non-meaning that Levi-Strauss called, quote, structure. All that Levi-Strauss needed to do to translate linguistics into the study of society was to take the phenomenon of society as a system of messages. Language is not the only means of exchanging information. All social interactions were exchanges of messages, as Mauss foresaw, which were amenable to structural analysis. In 1949, the book, The Elementary Structures of Kinship, appeared, in which Levi-Strauss uncovered, at a hitherto unprobed depth, the structures through which women were exchanged in traditional society. He showed that all social phenomena brought individuals together and separated them in fixed relations, while at the same time separating and relating man to nature. Society began with the universal prohibition of incest, distinguishing the natural system of biological reproduction from a social system in which small groups had to go beyond their own groups for mates, a theoretically unnecessary rule, but one that was the foundation of the human world. With incest banned, men entered into complex relations of exclusion and inclusion. Women were exchanged between groups in patterns that were more or less restrictive. Unlike structuralists and functionalists in Britain and the United States, Levi-Strauss was not concerned with the observable empirical facts of the exchanges or the structure of these facts. To the chagrin of the Anglo-American anthropologist, Levi-Strauss reduced the kinship system to a system of messages that was not located in the everyday life of society, but was the product of scientific labor. Quote, a kinship system does not consist in the objective ties of descent or consanguinity between individuals. A kinship system exists only in human consciousness. It is an arbitrary system of representations, not the spontaneous development of a real situation, end quote. Levi-Strauss. Anthropology became a science when it established the structure of human activities, material and spiritual, as systems of symbolic communication, disregarding the content of the activity and the intentionality of the participants. Everything that men did or said consisted of signs, organized into structures, into logical relations that were totally distinct from lived experience. Meaning appeared in the play of signifiers, not in social subjects. Society was hence decentered from the whirl of human subjectivity and shifted to the objectivity of structure. Ultimately, the complex interactions of men in society were unconscious projections of the brain's binary logic. When Levi-Strauss began his ambitious enterprise of classifying myths with the book The Raw and the Cooked in 1964, he applied the same principles used in the study of kinship. The fantastic stories that so engrossed European visitors of traditional societies were reduced to mathematical formulas. The elements of myths, like the part of a story in which a culture hero kills his father, were organized into patterns that were apparent only to the scientist. With seeming randomness, Levi-Strauss wove an intricate tapestry out of shreds of myths. One day, when the fundamental structural elements of all myths were known, the scientist would have in his computer nothing less than the human mind, the fixed atemporal structure of human consciousness. This humble study of structures led to the grand revelation of the universal mind of man, dispelling forever Western arrogance about the pre-logicality of the primitives. The popularity of Levi-Strauss in France began not with the book The Elementary Structures of Kinship, but with the poetic autobiographical travel and voyage report Triste Tropique of 1955. The hard scientist who wanted to systematize knowledge on punch cards presented himself there as a romantic, a Rousseauian, escaping the horrors of civilization to the tranquil artlessness of the savages. Yet the popular success of Triste Tropique was nothing compared with the intellectual success of the book The Savage Mind in 1962, an event marking the beginning of the era of structuralism. The rapid spread of structuralism as a general intellectual orientation has been explained in relation to the failure of existential Marxism adequately to account for what Sartre called the, quote, practico-inert, and what was henceforth to be known as, quote, structure. At first glance, structuralism might have complemented existential Marxism rather than emerging as a competing doctrine. Sartre's comments in his book Critique of Dialectical Reason about Levi-Strauss suggested that structural anthropology fit well with the progressive-regressive method. Such harmony was not to be. The problem was that the analogy Levi-Strauss drew between language and other social structures was made, in Sartre's view, too easily and was extended too far. It might well be the case that many social phenomena could be made intelligible through structural analysis. In addition to the work of Levi-Strauss on kinship and myth, Barthes applied it to the world of fashion, Foucault to epistemologies, Lacan to the unconscious, Althusser to economic structures, and countless literary critics to novels and poems. But could structural analysis be applied to social classes and industrial societies or to politics? More significantly, structural anthropology was unashamedly reductionist, eliminating from consideration all aspects of lived experience and conceding no value to other perspectives. Yet many fuzzy traits of structures are not clarified. For example, to the degree that language formed a structure of signifiers, just how far could it be linked to the very different fact of kinship? Worse, to phenomena like cities whose origin was well known. Furthermore, how did the fact that structuralists made us aware of structures change their unconscious epistemological status? Before exploring the theoretical controversy, we must mention the use of structural linguistics by Roland Barthes, the literary critic. Roland Barthes, the literary critic. An early editor of Argument, Barthes had connections with existential Marxism, and Barthes' use of structuralism to analyze everyday life was akin to that of Henri Lefebvre. The book Mythologies, which probably influenced Lefebvre, appeared in 1957 before the book The Savage Mind. Barthes analyzed ordinary experience like films, wrestling matches, striptease shows, advertisements, and propaganda, making subtle use of structuralist concepts. All social experience could be taken as signs, thus introducing a general science of signs, or semiology, which had been Saussure's dream. In advanced capitalist society, communications increasingly took on mythic semiological structure. To schematize Barthes' position, myth dehistoricized and depoliticized signs, making them appear as natural objects. The picture of a black man in French military uniform on the cover of Paris Match transmitted immediately the mythic information that French imperialism thrived. Enveloped by the image, the reader received this information in a haze, semi-consciously but powerfully. Semiology would disclose this mythic structure for what it was, a deliberate distortion. Thus structuralism need not oppose and contradict Marxism. Not only was structuralism compatible with Marxism, but the major structuralist figures, Levi-Strauss included, considered themselves Marxists, and one of the major communist theorists of the 1960s, Louis Althusser, was broadly speaking a structuralist. Heading B, Structure and the Unconscious. Under the banner of structuralism, Levi-Strauss vigorously opposed existentialism and phenomenology for their unscientific subjectivism. Lived experience provided no insight into being. Quote, as for the trend of thought which was to find fulfillment in existentialism, it seemed to me to be the exact opposite. Did I say quote? Quote, as for the trend of thought which was to find fulfillment in existentialism, it seemed to me to be the exact opposite of true thought, by reason of its indulgent attitude towards the illusions of subjectivity. To promote private preoccupations to the rank of philosophical problems is dangerous, and may end in a kind of shopgirl's philosophy, excusable as an element in teaching procedure, but perilous in the extreme if it leads the philosopher to turn back on his mission. That mission, he holds it only until science is strong enough to take over from philosophy, is to understand, being in relation to itself and not in relation to oneself. Being in relation to itself and not in relation to oneself. Phenomenology and existentialism did not abolish metaphysics, they merely introduced new ways of finding alibis for metaphysics. End quote. Levi-Strauss. Here is a remarkably clear statement of scientism. It disregards the fact that philosophy is a human activity. Levi-Strauss's first impulse was toward being, without the mediation of epistemological self-criticism. The expectation that philosophy would wither away under the force of scientific advance was another axiom of positivism. And that touch of asceticism, which has been lucidly exposed by Nietzsche, presumed that the scientist vanished in his own knowledge. This was Kantianism without a transcendental subject, admitted Levi-Strauss under fire from Ricoeur and Dufresne. Esprit group phenomenologists. The self-proclaimed Kantian ethnologists discovered the absolute categories of mind only from the base of a finite empirical scientific subjectivity. On the other hand, his position against existentialism on the ground that the immediate certainties of experience were an inadequate avenue to truth forgot that phenomenologists refused the naive statements of natural consciousness, distinguishing them from reflective consciousness. Structural anthropology differed from existentialism as hard over the intelligibility of subjective reality and over the relation of knowledge to action. Finally, after all the data about society or mind has been processed by the computer, one must still decide what to do with it. To Sartre and to Marxists, it was still knowledge for man. To Sartre and to Marxists, it was still knowledge for man. To the important phenomenologist, Michel Dufresne, quote, in whatever element it moves, the thought of man always encounters the exhausting task of returning thought to the thinker. Whatever is said of man, it is the man who says it, end quote. If structuralism, that's from, and that quote was Michel Dufresne. If structuralism was to mount a challenge against phenomenology and existentialism, it would have to be on the ground that consciousness was not an intelligible object. The commitment of Levi-Strauss to science was profound. The passion of this singularly unsavage mind was to mathematize the knowledge of society. Quote, starting from ethnographic experience, I've always aimed at drawing up an inventory of mental patterns, When the mind is left to commune with itself and no longer has to come to terms with objects, it is in a sense reduced to imitating itself as object, It shows itself to be the nature of a thing among things, end quote. Paradoxically, Levi-Strauss's dream of total knowledge, in which the mind confronted itself in perfect reciprocity with its object, led him to explore the social object in search of the mind that was not there. The mind was the essence of society without being empirically given. This perfect object was structure. In order to arrive at it, it was necessary for him to deny the empirical consciousness, the dignity of meaning. Hence the notorious structuralist inversion, quote, I claim to show not how men think in myths, but how myths operate in men's minds without their being aware of the fact, end quote. The real was the rational, but without the savages knowing it, a final insult to the primitives from the colonialists. In good faith, Levi-Strauss could invoke the support of Marx, Freud, and even Sartre. Quote, Marx and Freud taught us that man has meaning only on the condition that he viewed himself as meaningful. So far I agree with Sartre, but it must be added that this meaning is never the right one. Superstructures are faulty acts which have, quote, made it socially. Hence it is vain to go to historical consciousness for the truest meaning, end quote. Surely Sartre would agree. Distorted consciousness prevailed everywhere over transparent truth. But from the Hegelian base, existential Marxism posited an evolution, a dialectical movement of consciousness through nature and society and through various forms of systematic distortion toward the possibility of a greater elimination of, quote, faulty constructions of meaning. Existentialism claimed that man created his own meanings. Existential Marxism, with the concept of scarcity, added that there was a meaning to the history of the meanings man created. Most adamantly, Levi-Strauss and structuralism denied this. The meanings, sense, man made for himself were non-meanings, nonsense. Meanings being, when I've been saying sense, it's like a specific term, like in French, S-E-N, so it's probably sen, or sen. Marx made, let me repeat that sentence then. Most adamantly, Levi-Strauss and structuralism denied this. The meanings, sen, man made for himself, were non-meanings, non-sen. I don't know if I'm saying that fucking right. It sounds so stupid. The phenomenologist Paul Ricoeur was displeased by the exclusiveness of Levi-Strauss's position. Did not sociocultural phenomena have many levels of signification beyond that of structure? Did not hermeneutics, the recovery of the meaning of the subject, have a role in the human sciences? For example, Levi-Strauss totemism was nothing more than a system of signs that separated clans and related them. Quote, natural species are classed in pairs of opposites, end quote, with some analogy from the species to the social group. A totem was nothing more than a name. The fact that the totem animal was experienced as sacred, that rituals and myths pivoted around it, these aspects of the conscious experience of the totem by the native carried no significant scientific meaning. Yet the phenomenologist exulted in the sacred quality of the totem, marveling at the richness of meaning embodied in it. Conversely, the sole interest of Levi-Strauss was in uncovering the binary pattern of signs in the social custom, attributing them to an underlying mental logic and ultimately to the brain. Structuralists had indeed brought to light a new level of meaning, but they concluded from this that the structure was necessarily opposed to the subject. They shifted attention away from any reconciliation of object and subject toward a programmatic examination of the systematic incongruities between structure and subject, without accepting the need for concrete studies to determine if human beings could self-consciously design structures. The structuralists appear to have relied upon certain aspects of the contemporary Lebenswelt. With the unchecked growth of bureaucratic structures in advanced industrial society, structures that were ruled by no one, with the dissolution of historical consciousness, the sense that the future was not in the hands of the people, it should not be too surprising that a theory developed in which society was composed of agentless structures, generalizing from the distinction between the subject and his language to posit a fixed disjuncture between social beings and institutions that effectively excluded liberating action, was not only unproved, but worked into the hands of the ruling class. If Levi-Strauss is right that no social agent could be attributed to the origin of language, the same be said of the absolute state. When Louis XIV invented the syntax of daily life at Versailles, he, and for that matter, Duc de Saint-Simon, knew perfectly well what was happening. The semiology of Louis's morning habits was an etiquette fatefully damaging to the nobility. His nods and signs of recognition were part of an orchestrated system of political dominance. Where the hell am I? If some structures rose and fell by themselves, others were the products of social action. The pertinent question, could alienating structures be dismantled by social action, was not answered by Levi-Strauss. On the other hand, Marxism assumed too quickly not that the ego was the absolute center of its own experience, but that it was centered enough to choose effective revolutionary action. New section C, from subject to structure. The aim of, quote, decentering human experience, of eliminating the egoistic illusion of man's location at the metaphysical center of things, was not new with structuralism. Copernicus, quote, decentered man and his planet from a privileged place in the universe. Darwin, quote, decentered the human species, placing it in an evolutionary chain of biological forms. Freud, quote, decentered the moral concept of the ego as the autonomous agent of the personality. Continuing in the line of man's detractors, structuralism decentered man from his own meanings. The conscious subject was displaced from the center of social activity. With Hegel, thought moved from substance to subject. With Levi-Strauss, it went from subject to structure. What Levi-Strauss drummed into the civilized, quote, domesticated mentality was that structure is unconscious. Quote, we are led to conceive of social structures as entities independent of men's consciousness of them, although in fact they govern men's existence, end quote. The emphasis fell on the distance between structure and consciousness, rather than on the complete unawareness of structure. At times, he was willing to grant that the complex patterns of kinship that he developed could be sketched by the native, rare as this was. But generally in lived experience, the structure was beneath consciousness. The, quote, subject is the one who speaks, ... His discourse never was and never will be the result of a conscious totalization of linguistic laws, end quote. Levi-Strauss. From this, scientists concluded that the ego was not the center of social reality and that science must take drastic measures. Quote, I believe the ultimate goal of the human sciences is not to constitute but to dissolve man, end quote. Levi-Strauss. The dissolution of man, the battle cry of structuralism, would leave the scientist the task of taking, quote, an inventory of mental enclosures, end quote, such that the underlying logical structure of the mind, which is the same everywhere, would be known. For Levi-Strauss, the foundation of structure was no longer man, but being. In sum, structural anthropology would displace the subject in two ways. The focus of intelligibility shifted from the subject to the structure, and then within the structure, it looked not for the expression of meanings, quote, signified, but for the pattern of elements, signifiers. There's a footnote that I missed. Agreeing on the unconsciousness of structures for the ego, Lévi-Strauss and Lacan were worlds apart on its nature. For the anthropologist, the unconscious was a sterile realm of repetition, whereas Lacan, following Freud, it was the intentional quality of desire or eros, a teleological, meaningful structure. End footnote. The task of decentering the subject was carried further by the Freudian Jacques Lacan, the second major structuralist figure whose abstruse discourse applied structuralism to the psyche. A contemporary of Sartre and Lévi-Strauss, Lacan had practiced and theorized about psychoanalysis since the 1930s, but was unknown to social theorists until Althusser introduced him at the École Normale Supérieure in the early 1960s. He directed his, quote, subversion of the ego as much against Freudians as against existentialists and Marxists. The Freudians had developed an ego psychology that gave the ego more autonomy, more unity than had Freud. As for the existentialists and Marxists, Lacan actually negated the same bourgeois concept of the ego that they had. Marx berating individualism in the book The Jewish Question, and Sartre's early positions against the calculating self. Lacan, however, conceptualized the decentering far more than they. The picture of the ego as an autonomous, unified captain of the soul, or the hope that it should be so, was Lacan's chief target. Following Lévi-Strauss, Lacan introduced linguistic theory in his fight against egoism, redefining the therapeutic process as a talking cure with new prominence given to the role of language. To Lacan, linguistics decentered the subject since the signifier represented a subject, quote, not for another subject, but for another signifier, end quote. The spoken I could never enunciate the actual I. Hence, quote, I am not in what I say. I am not where I think. I do not think where I am, end quote. Lacan. The level of language The level of language was so distinct from the level of the subject that the mediation of speaking did not unify the two. Worse still, there was a second level of structure, a second language. The unconscious was itself structured, enunciating the language of desire. In the new structuralist Freud, the ego was decentered between two levels, the language of culture and of desire. Freud had introduced the concept of unconsciousness to explain the absence of the self in the words of the subject. Free association, dream analysis, slips, jokes, hypnosis, these methods circumvented the ego, moving from the language of culture to that of desire. To attain a substantial unity of the self, the ego had to be disunified. Such concepts as the, quote, total personality of the gestaltists and the unified intentionality of the phenomenologists were pure fictions to Lacan. Systematic misunderstanding, méconnaissance, characterized the ego's relation to itself. Quote, life goes down the river, from time to time touching a bank, staying for a while here and there, without understanding anything, and is the principle of analysis, that nobody understands anything of what happens. The idea of the unifying unity of the human condition has always had on me the effect of a scandalous lie. End quote. Lacan. With Lévi-Strauss, the subject was split off from social structures. With Lacan, it was divorced from itself. Freudian structuralism subverted the ego both synchronically and diachronically. Synchronically, the ego was immersed in otherness. Diachronically, the ego was lost in the unconscious structure of desire, quote, fading, and slipping from its phantasm of an object that was its illusory foundation. In the, quote, mirror stage of its development, the child identified with the image of the other. Before it had the capability of distinguishing itself from another person, the child perceived the other as himself, as in a mirror. In this first constitution of the individual's identity, there was a radical misrecognition. From then on, the ego would name itself while actually referring to the imaginary other. The self was a composite of false interjections, hardly a unified personality. Ego and other were inextricably confused in the language of the self. The second permanent structural distortion of the ego was that of unconscious desire. Like Hegel with his concept of desire as the, quote, law of the heart, end quote, Lacan viewed the ego's desire as an ungratifiable quest for the desire of the other. In each demand, each need could be satisfied, but never the desire that moved the ego towards its unattainable, lost object. With these difficult concepts of otherness and desire, Lacan dismantled the centered subject. The pleasant sense of coherence that the individual might enjoy was shown by Lacan to be nothing more than an illusion. The suggestive, if heterodox, reading of Freud went further than the master in displacing the secondary processes of the ego toward the primary processes of desire. Freud's program for psychoanalysis, quote, where the id was, the ego shall be, end quote, provided for an ultimate reintegration of the ego. Lacan reinterpreted the program to coincide with his subversion. Quote, the ego of the analyst, no doubt, must dislodge the id of the patient, end quote. Lacan would not allow psychoanalysis to serve the autonomous ego. Yet he did not allow for an authentic ego. He did not allow for an authentic ego in genuine, quote, interpersonal communication, as in the therapeutic situations. Here Lacan envisioned a socialized ego, a bit like Sartre's individual in the group infusion, that accepted the otherness of its identity. Still, the decentering was open to the criticism made by Freud of Paul Ricoeur that it did not account for unifying processes like sublimation. If Lacan destroyed Enlightenment liberalism, it is difficult to say how much his theories were a threat to existential Marxism, even though many regarded them as such. In Sartre's critique of dialectical reason, the individual was centered only through reciprocity, through totalization, and through all the corrective mediations that constitute his historical being in the world. Even then, centering was always distorted by scarcity, by objectification, and by alienation. It was not all clear that structural psychoanalysis was antithetical to existential Marxism. New section, section D. Savage and dialectical minds. Levi-Strauss and the Structuralists raised once again the old boogie against Sartre and existential Marxism, the charge of the cogito. By the 1960s, the Marxists had lowered their guns, granting that Sartre and Merleau-Ponty that they relied on some form of phenomenology to account for the subjective nature of human experience, were far from the idealism of Husserl, with his transcendental ego, his concept of the ego as the absolute foundation of experience and truth, which indeed had a Cartesian resonance. Yet in the book The Savage Mind, Levi-Strauss did ascribe the cogito to Sartre's thought. Quote, he who begins by steeping himself in the allegedly self-evident truths of introspection never emerges from them. ... Sartre, in fact, becomes the prisoner of his cogito. Descartes made it possible to attain universality, but conditionally on remaining psychological and individual. By sociologizing the cogito, Sartre merely exchanges one prison for another. End quote. Levi-Strauss. To be precise, Sartre was accused of speculative philosophy over against scientific analysis, not of idealism as opposed to materialism. Stumbling over his own weapons, Levi-Strauss in the same text brought up the opposite charge of historicism, that Sartre immersed the knower in the flood of history. It could not be both ways. Either Sartre erred by relativizing reason within history, Either Sartre erred in the traditional solitude of the absolute ego, or he erred by relativizing reason within history. The best mental acrobat could not accomplish both. The prosecuting structuralists were better off in condescending the count of the cogito. The prosecuting structuralists were better off in conceding the count of the cogito and staying with their basic charge that no form of philosophy of consciousness could account for unseen structures. It was here that the structuralists would win their verdict and even contribute to the development of existential Marxism. Sartre's dialectical reason was a method of comprehending the visible intentionality of the social field, whether that intentionality originated from individuals, groups, or processed matter. All, quote, presences could be woven into dialectical cloth, but structures made their effects through their, quote, absences, through their invisibility. The linguistic structure was absent from discourse as the speaker focused on the content of his discourse. So too with social structures. One is aware of buying this object in the store, not of the structure of commodities. The structuralists also accused Sartre of humanism, again deriving this flaw from the original sin of the cogito. The decentering of the ego implied to them that the popular forms of humanism, existentialism, Marxism, Christian personalism, Freudianism, and phenomenology would have to be abandoned. The battle over humanism was fierce, but the issue, it seems, was one of emphasis, not of principle. To Levi-Strauss, knowledge could not begin with a statement about man, quote, that a properly appointed humanism cannot begin of its own accord, but must place the world before life, life before man, end quote. Levi-Strauss. Too often, humanist doctrines assumed that man acted on the model of the artist, deliberately shaping objects with full consciousness. It was this focus on the individual at the point of creation that perturbed the structuralists. Marx was guilty of, quote, humanism when he adopted Feuerbach's notion of man as self-conscious action. Sartre, too, leaned this way when he posited freedom as the self-creation of man. Yet neither Marx nor Sartre spoke of society as the simple sum of autonomous individual actions. Marx always mediated individual action through social structures, and Sartre postulated that the choices the individual made were pre-reflective. In the final analysis, Levi-Strauss's argument against humanism concerned the prominence of history and historical knowledge in human affairs. Humanism argued that man created history, that the praxis of the subject was the ground of social structures, while structuralists maintained that structures had no agents and did not become intelligible through the study of agents. The locus classicus of the encounter was in Levi-Strauss's chapter devoted to Sartre in the book The Savage Mind, and in Sartre's replies. Levi-Strauss agreed that both structuralism and existential Marxism were totalizing conceptions, finding basic unities at the level of the totality, with the individual element in a subordinate position to the larger structure. In these respects, both were anti-liberal. Levi-Strauss could not agree with Sartre's definition of dialectical reason, preferring to call his own method dialectical. What was outrageous to Levi-Strauss in Sartre's critique, however, was that he labeled his own project a, quote, structural anthropology, without having the slightest understanding of structures. Sartre reduced structures to, quote, pure seriality, end quote, giving them a vague, quote, natural mode of existence. For Sartre, with his notion of the total antinomy between man and nature, all objectivity was anti-human, quote, naturalness. The opposition between man and nature led to Sartre's, quote, disordered and lawless form of humanism, in which man, lord and master of nature, exist on one side. On the other side, there is nature entirely exterior to him. That makes nature no more than a thing, an object, an instrument. End quote. The inadequate concept of social structure as seriality was said to be symptomatic of all Sartre's errors. Behind the opposition of man and nature lay Sartre's vision of history as the arena in which man conquered nature. Levi-Strauss was not completely opposed to the value of history in general, although he distinguished it sharply from anthropology and placed it in a second rank. Quote, history organizes its data in relation to conscious expressions of social life, while anthropology proceeds by examining unconscious foundations, end quote. A distinction which many historians would not agree. The unconscious, quote, impose forms, end quote, and these forms are theoretically prior to patterns of change. History could not be, to Levi-Strauss, a story of human control over nature. Instead, it was a succession of structures, each of which was essentially atemporal in the sense that it had no, quote, origin, and therefore no rise and development. If historians took these structures as their object of investigation, quote, events, in the traditional sense, would have only secondary importance. Missing the structural core of society, historians invented a code, a series of dates that constitute an irreversible sequence of befores and afters. The function of the codes was to establish continuity when, in fact, social structures demarcated pure discontinuity between different levels and different structures. Quote, history seems to restore to us not separate states, but the passage from one state to another in a continuous form, ... It appears to reestablish our connection outside ourselves at the very essence of change. Here was the core of the structuralist position. History was the historian's method of transforming objective reality into a placid, recognizable home for himself. A way of erasing the strange and the unfamiliar. A way of making everything understandable in terms of himself. Of relating the entirety of experience to his own little world. Here was the core of the structuralist position. History was the historian's method of transforming objective reality into a placid, recognizable home for himself, a way of erasing the strange and the unfamiliar, a way of making everything understandable in terms of himself, of relating the entirety of experience to his own little world, without recognizing that he was doing so. History projected the, quote, totalizing continuity of the self, and, quote, into the world. The description is familiar. History is seen as myth-making. Levi-Strauss complained that Sartre, in his critique of dialectical reason, excluded all traditional societies from knowledge by limiting the efficacy of dialectical reason to those societies that had interiorized history, or in Sartre's words, that had consciously taken on the project of struggling against scarcity. Levi-Strauss's limitation to traditional society was supposedly not theoretically significant. The opposition here was between Sartre, who studied historical societies and claimed the primacy of history, and Levi-Strauss, who studied historical societies, claiming the primacy of atemporal structures. Levi-Strauss acknowledged that his own studies of primitive societies were not a fruitful ground for the historical approach, since there was no documentation. He did insist that all societies were historical, that all changed, and he granted that there was a fundamental rupture between primitive and industrial worlds. Quote, in fact, every human society has a history, but whereas so-called primitive societies are surrounded by the substance of history and try to remain impervious to it, modern societies interiorize history, as it were, and turn it into the motive power of their development, end quote. Levi-Strauss. There was, I suggest, a curious double bind in Levi-Strauss's position. Primitive societies, quote, impervious, end quote, to history, did away with change only by creating myths that camouflage the temporal as atemporal. Historical societies, having, quote, interiorized history, also created myths, except these were in the form of history. Either way, one lost because myths were, quote, inauthentic forms of knowledge. Quote, myth is the most fundamental form of inauthenticity. I define authenticity as the concrete nature of the knowledge people have of each other, and contrary to what might seem to be the case, there is nothing more abstract than myth. Myths depend on propositions which, when we try to analyze them, force us to resort to symbolic logic. End quote. Levi-Strauss. Structuralist logic ran, all societies are historical. All societies deal with history by myth-making. Myth-making is inauthentic. The fact that some historical societies interiorize history did not legitimate historical knowledge, since the only valid knowledge of a society pertained to its structure. To Levi-Strauss, Sartre was guilty of myth-making. His group Infusion invoked the, quote, myth of the French Revolution, end quote, in which there was indeed a maximum, quote, congruency between practical imperatives and the schemes of interpretation, end quote. The revolutionaries knew what they were doing in establishing new institutions, so their myth was the, quote, truest, but it was still a myth, one that, quote, men of the left, and, quote, cling to as, quote, the golden age of historical consciousness, end quote. Levi-Strauss granted a certain necessity to myth-making. Quote, the question is to know whether what we are trying to attain is what is true in and of the consciousness we have of it, or outside this consciousness. I believe it is perfectly legitimate to look inside by a recovery of meaning, except that this recovery, this interpretation philosophers or historians give of their own mythology, I treat simply as a variant of that mythology itself, end quote. Levi-Strauss. The only refuge from myth was science, which stood outside the social sub-object in order to attain knowledge of it, refusing to immerse the knower in society or to build continuities between the knower and his object. Paradoxically, the otherness of primitive societies facilitated the adoption of the scientific attitude by the very distance between the knower and the known. Here Levi-Strauss neglected the role of the otherness of exotic, non-industrialized worlds for the romantic and for the anthropologist. Often primitive society had continuity with Mother Europe by way of its very difference and distance from it, as it did for Malinowski, who found his intellectual utopia in the Amazon, in a world where the anthropologist could make whatever he wanted of what he saw. Yet Sartre's philosophy remained pure myth for Levi-Strauss. Quote, something which can be true when we look at it from inside a culture is no longer true when we try to consider it from the outside. Therefore, I'm in full agreement with Marx and even with Sartre when they say that for a member of a modern contemporary civilization, things appear this way. History has a meaning and should have, because it's the only way to give a wider meaning to civilization itself. I can perfectly well claim, at the same time, that while this is true inside the society of the observer, it ceases to be true when we try to reflect a broader point of view and look at it from the outside. Levi-Strauss. Of course, this epistemology of the outside, of the look, was completely divorced from considerations of praxis. To reject any connection between objective knowledge and our subjective existence was to deny the vital bond between theory and action. At times the connection would be made too easily, as in the case of Stalinism, with the consequence of myth-making. But Levi-Strauss moved to the other extreme of positivism, with the result that the actual connection he finally drew between scientific knowledge and practice was purely utopian. Levi-Strauss violently denied the Hegelian effort to locate the unity of mankind through a stadial concept of history. There was no, quote, succession or evolution of societies. The primitives are not lower in some evolutionary scale than the moderns. With history discarded, where could the unity of mankind, if there was any, be located? For Levi-Strauss, such unity existed only as a possibility in the sum of all structural combinations. Through this implicit unity, different societies could be located atemporally and without any hierarchy, as having chosen unconsciously, of course, one particular combination. Structural anthropology radically excluded the search for origins and for ends, preserving the discontinuity of social formations against any theme progressist, eschatological, cyclical, that arrayed them in an evolutionary order. Yet there was temporal movement for Levi-Strauss, which he called, quote, structural history, end quote, without being able to give this notion much coherence. Structural history concerns the diachronic transformation of structures. Structures were always changing because a disparity existed between rules and the signs representing them, each of which was an integrated system. In addition to this internal contradiction, there was, quote, external factors such as environmental modifications. Structural history would comprise the changes in the combination of any system and temporal sequence. Levi-Strauss's concept of history denied man's creative capacity by reducing novelty to shifting mixtures of the same elements. If one wanted to refute the charge by Lefebvre that Levi-Strauss was a technocrat, no better testimony could be marshaled than his concept of history. It undercut not only the utopian aspects of existential Marxism, but the technocratic faith in productivity, growth, and technical mastery of nature. Insofar as structuralism broke through those faiths and allowed room for ecological criticism of unbridled scientific development, it served a beneficent function. The trouble was that Levi-Strauss's own utopianism, a weird combination of scientific knowledge and pastoral calm, a kind of inversion of Teilhard de Chardin, I don't know if I'm saying that right, was hardly better. For Levi-Strauss, man's only hope lay in ending the conquest of nature, dehistoricizing Europe, completing technological development, and then imitating the primitives. Quote, history would make itself by itself. Society, placed outside and above history, would be able to exhibit once again that regular and as it were, crystalline structure which the best preserved of primitive societies teach us is not antagonistic to the human condition. In this perspective, utopian as it might seem, social anthropology would find its highest justification, since the forms of life and thought which it studies would no longer have a purely historical or comparative interest. They would correspond to a permanent hope for mankind, over which social anthropology, particularly in the most troubled times, would have a mission to keep watch. End quote. Levi-Strauss. The musty spell of the Anthropological Museum was decked out as a flickering hope for man. Levi-Strauss's utopian statement, which followed logically from his positions and was not a passing remark, revealed his underlying Rousseauian faith in pre-literate small-scale society, where reality was transparent not to its members but to the outsider. This self-styled Marxism would render socialist praxis impossible. Sartre's replies to Levi-Strauss are often more defensive and harsh than pertinent. He could not answer the charge that he misconstrued nature as a thing, opposing man to it in a stance of conquest. In this respect, structuralism, quote, deconstructed the obsolete antinomy of man and nature better than existential Marxism, nor could Sartre detract from the advantages that Levi-Strauss's approach to structures had over his own concept of the practico-inert. He insisted, however, that the structure, whatever its internal system of coherence, was a product of human praxis. Quote, I am in complete agreement that social facts have their own structure and laws that dominate individuals, but I see in this the reply of worked matter to the agents who work it. ... Structures are created by activity, which has no structure, but suffers its results as a structure. End quote. The failure to relate structures to their interior, constituting activity, would lead inevitably to a mechanical view of society and to a determinist assumption about man. In Sartre's eyes, omission of the place of creative praxis in the formation of structures also distorted the role of history. Although historical knowledge was man-centered and oriented toward a future that was not fixed, thereby preparing for that future in the manner of myth, the structuralist concept of society excluded the future completely. Quote, for structuralism, history is an internal product of the system. There are as many histories as structured societies. Each society produces its temporality. Progress is the development of order. This historical pluralism subordinates history, ... to structural order. The future remains anticipated, but at the interior of well-defined limits. In a positivist sense, in this way it is viewed as already in the past. It will be understood as interior future. It will realize the social agent that it produces, and that it conditions the future being that is implicitly present in its past. In other words, it is not to be made, but to be predicted. Praxis is here eliminated in favor of process. In this crucial passage, Sartre defended history as the human freedom haunting all structures by putting the future of those structures in question. Only when this was done could the existence of structures in the present be captured without reification. The opposite of myth, historical understanding denaturalized the practical field of society. When historical knowledge was self-consciously grounded in a situation, itself historical, and oriented to future action, it reduced to a minimum its mythic quality, since it relativized its own position in accordance with its own finitude. What structuralism justly discredited in Sartre's eyes were those historical constructs that failed to recognize their own contingency, like 19th century Whig history and 20th century Stalinism, among others. Sartre granted that structures were a moment of the practico inert, but they had to be located within the largest totalization of history, in which an important determination of meaning came from man. The incompatibility of Sartre and structuralism was slightly reduced during the 1960s. In 1966, Sartre objected too strongly to the structuralist decentering of man. He overly restricted the lack of presence of the ego, quote, neurosis, although he rightly called for empirical proof of the degree of decentering in specific cases. Quote, the real question, is knowing how the subject or subjectivity constitutes itself by a perpetual process of integration and reintegration on a base prior to it. Quote. Or in dialectical formulation, quote, what is essential is not that man is made, but that he makes that which made him. End quote. Sartre. By 1969, Sartre, while still positing the man-made nature of structures, accounted for the decentered subject by replacing his former concept of consciousness with a more ambiguous notion of lived experience. This concept permitted a large degree of unconsciousness while preserving the final freedom of the subject. Lived experience was neither consciousness nor unconsciousness, but, quote, the terrain in which the individual is perpetually overflowed by himself and his riches, and consciousness plays the trick of determining itself by forgetfulness, end quote. In lived experience, the subject is absent, distorted by numerous forms of alienation and neurosis. Yet he is also present enough to reappropriate his absence so that, acting collectively, he can remove the distortions of the structure without eliminating its necessary features as a vehicle of communication and reciprocity. A skeptical interviewer pressed Sartre on this point. How could individual acts possibly result in ordered structures? It was here that many concepts of history went astray. Relying either on pre-established harmonies or the cunning of reason, Sartre was manifestly hard-pressed for an answer. He replied by outlining his projected second volume of the Critique of Dialectical Reason, where he planned to show that, quote, there is an institutional order which is necessarily the product of masses of men constituting a social unity, and which at the same time is radically distinct from all of them, end quote. The next task for existential Marxism would be to integrate structuralism by showing how the order and decenteredness of structures cohabited the social field with subjects acting in dispersed unconscious groups. New section, Section E, Foucault's Science Without Scientists. The enfant terrible of structuralism was Michel Foucault. More than anyone else, Foucault evoked passionate protests. He was the enemy of man, reason, democracy, a danger to order. He was a wild irrationalist, a nihilistic misanthrope who gloated in the destruction of humanity. In truth, Foucault, more than anyone else, defined the limits of structuralism and prepared for its possible integration with existential Marxism. The theme of decentering man was extended by Foucault with dramatic force. The future of man would not be a final triumph, but a humbling dissolution. Quote, man would be a race, like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea. End quote. Foucault, The Order of Things. The Nietzschean wish for the death of God was applied to man with an anger equal to the anchorites. Quote, rather than the death of God, what Nietzsche's thought heralded is the end of his murderer. Man is in the process of dissolution. End quote. Foucault. With a sharpness calculated to irritate his opponents, Foucault aimed his daggers carefully and threw them swiftly at that bundle of illusions so despised by structuralism: humanism, historicism, philosophical anthropology, philosophies of consciousness. For Foucault, it was Hegel's phenomenology of spirit that initiated false humanism. Drawing upon the resources of structural linguistics, Foucault enunciated the major trend of modern thought as the expansion of man's domain over the world. Quote, modern thought is advancing towards that region where man's other must become the same as himself. Unquote. The impulse of modernity was to project human finitude as an absolute principle over the whole of creation. The great minds of the past century, Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, the new list of saints, pushed back the limits of the unknown and of the unconscious. Quote, the whole of modern thought is imbued with the necessity of thinking the unthought, of reflecting the contents, of the in itself in the form of the for itself, of ending man's alienation by reconciling man with his own essence, of lifting the veil of the unconscious. End quote. Foucault. Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud strove for a new unity with the awareness that it was absent. These great ones, quote, decentered man by pointing to structures that were not deliberately created by man. In the book Les mots et les choses, Foucault unveiled yet another hidden structure, the episteme, which was totally unconscious, like kinship, myth, and desire. The episteme worked at the level of knowledge, limiting the way objects were defined and perceived. Relations of words and things were governed by unconscious rules that delimited the boundaries of discourse. What Foucault stressed was the discontinuity between successive epistemes, the principle that they were not the product of intentional creativity, that consciousness was not sovereign, even in its own home of knowledge. Furthermore, the specific episteme, in which man, consciousness, ego, or subject was elevated to the center of reality, was only of very recent origin. It was a transitory structure that was bound for imminent disappearance. Quote, it is not men who constitute the human sciences and provide them with a specific domain. It is the general arrangement of the episteme that provides them with a site, summons them, and establishes them, and thus enabling them to constitute man as their object. A, quote, human science, end quote, exists not where man is in question, but wherever there is analysis, within the dimension proper to the unconscious, of norms, rules, and signifying totalities, which unveil to consciousness the conditions of its forms and contents. End quote. Foucault, The Order of Things. Foucault studied the history of science in its most favored place, not in the distant Amazon, but in modern Europe. Hence he confronted humanism at its heart. His campaign was fought with no amenities of civilization. He wrote articles in prominent journals with titles like, Is Man Dead? Footnote. On page 6 of Is Man Dead, he argued that structuralism was incompatible with humanism. Sartre and others were irritated by Foucault's apparent challenge to Marxism. The lesson of the episteme was that man did not make his own history. Instead, the episteme made man. It was one thing for Levi-Strauss to demonstrate that the primitives did not make their own kinship structures. For Lacan, to show that the ego was immersed in unconscious desire. But it was outrageous to assert that the most self-conscious activity of human experience was beyond human control. Perhaps social structures bore the quality of blindness. This could be corrected in the future. However, if man did not fashion the structure of knowledge, it would be theoretically impossible for man to shape history. Yet there was a weak spot in les mots et les choses, which was pounced upon by Sartre and others. It was Foucault's failure to account for the succession of the succession of epistemes. I don't know what this book is referring to. That book. So this should be a title. Anyway, the dismal import of Foucault's thesis was chanted sonorously by Bertherat, writing in Esprit, quote, "What man discovers beyond his representation, his interiority is ... a question without a subject, coming from this mute region where language arises, from this dead space where life is repeated, from this object always lost, that obsesses desire. The modern age is the age of separation, of limits, and if there is a humanism, ... and a science of man, it is to the degree that the unity of man, the world, and words is defeated." End quote. Yves Bertherat. Yet, existential Marxists, Christian personalists, phenomenologists, Marxist humanists, all those who felt opposed to structuralism were deceived by its apparent prognosis of the end of man. Long ago, Roman Jacobson suggested that structuralism was not the end of humanity, but of private property. Structuralism maintained that communication of language was inherently social, and that any phenomenon that was withdrawn from the social system, like private property, must be doomed. The implications of structuralism were suddenly the same as those of existential Marxism. In their effort to clear space for their ideas, the structuralists had exaggerated their attack upon the dominant intellectual trends, while their opponents defensively overreacted in response. The chance of theoretical complementarity between existential Marxism and structuralism was nowhere more clearly stated than by that arch-enemy of man, Michel Foucault, in the book The Archaeology of Knowledge of 1969. Foucault made it clear that history was not the continuous linear evolution of events assumed by humanists. Discontinuity, ruptures, the dispersion of the subject, uncentered anonymity. These were the true qualities of history, as historians themselves were beginning to show. Unconsciousness was a fact, not an ideological belief. What Foucault found in history were discourses without agents and structures without subjects. However, once the quote inhumaneness, end quote, of history was acknowledged, it was then possible to quote recover in the second degree what we have lost over the last half century. It seemed to me that, for the moment, the essential task was to free the history of thought from its objection to transcendence, end quote. Foucault. The raging battle over structuralism could now be viewed with some perspective. Its task was now accomplished. Quote, "My aim was to analyze this history in the discontinuity that no teleology would reduce in advance, to locate it in a dispersion that no pre-established horizon would embrace, or allow it to be deployed in an anonymity on which no transcendental constitution would impose the form of the subject, to open it up to a temporality that would not promise the return of any dawn. My aim was to cleanse it all of all transcendental narcissism." End quote. Foucault. The philosopher of the quote end of man now conceded that he asked no more than the recognition of the quote right of a piece of empirical research, some fragment of history, to challenge the transcendental dimension, end quote. Foucault. Once that was achieved, quote, the powers of constituent consciousness, end quote, could again be maintained. The final touch to the integration of structuralism in existential Marxism came from Foucault himself. Structures do not limit freedom, they are simply situations. Quote, "The positivities that I have tried to establish must not be understood as a set of determinations imposed from the outside on the thought of individuals, or inhabiting it from the inside, in advance as it were. They constitute rather the set of conditions in accordance with which a practice is exercised, in accordance with which that practice gives rise to partially or totally new statements, and in accordance with which it can be modified. These positivities are not so much limitations imposed on the initiative of subjects as the field in which that initiative is articulated, rules that it put into operation, relations that provide it with a support. I have not denied, far from it, the possibility of changing discourse. I have deprived the sovereignty of the subject of the exclusive and instantaneous right to it." End quote. Foucault. In the end, structuralism promoted social change by articulating the structure of the practico inert, a task that Sartre had not completed. Foucault placed himself in the same camp with the rebels of May 1968. Quote, "What the students are trying to do, and what I myself am trying to accomplish, is basically the same thing. What I am trying to do is grasp the implicit systems which determine our most familiar behavior without our knowing it. I'm trying to find their origin, to show their formation, the constraint they impose upon us. I'm therefore trying to place myself at a distance from them and to show how one could escape." End quote. Foucault. This radical position emerged from the structuralist camp only after May 1968. One wonders if radicalism was implicit in the structure of the structuralism, or if the students and workers create a situation in which it had to change. New section. Althusser's Revolution without rebels. When Marxists began translating Marx into structuralist language, the Communist Party was dominated theoretically by Roger Garaudy and his effort of dialogue and reconciliation with humanists, existentialists, socialists, and Christians. Garaudy magnanimously, but facilely, integrated the young Marx into Communist Party orthodoxy. Everyone was welcome aboard the Marxist ship, which was repainted in the bright colors of humanism. Garaudy's ecumenical campaign merited skepticism because it manifested the sheen of surface de-Stalinization in a party that was becoming integrated in the Gaullist regime. Even with its new paint, the Communist Party vessel would not disturb the flotilla of France on its way to the shores of advanced capitalism. Marxist humanism went hand in hand with the revised Soviet strategy of coexistence. The more Garaudy pontificated on alienation and dehumanization, the more the French workers were directed to support de Gaulle's glorious France. Against this open-handed strategy of Marxist humanism came the, quote, theoretical anti-humanism, end quote, of Louis Althusser, a Communist Party member himself and a philosopher at the École Normale Supérieure. Along with Maurice Godelier and Lucien Sabag, two young anthropologists, Althusser prepared a structuralist reading of Marx. One second. Althusser's intellectual pilgrimage in the 1960s contained distinct phases, but was basically unified in a single direction. His early articles sharply attacked all forms of Marxist humanism, the reading of Marx that relied heavily on the 1844 manuscripts. At the same time, he denounced the economism of Diamat. Althusser must not be seen as a regression to Stalinism, as many contend, but a new departure in Marxist thought. Footnote, see For Marx translated by Ben Brewster, 1970, from For Marx of 1965, where Althusser situated his own thought against the overreaction of anti-Stalinism. And footnote. Yeah, that was kind of one of the things that you hear in the secondary literatures that that was Foucault, that Althusser at least had this conception he was going to provide the first left-wing critique of Stalinism, which is fucking hilarious. Dismissing the philosophical anthropology of Marxist humanism based on the concept of alienation, Althusser redefined dialectical materialism and historical materialism based on different epistemological premises. Far from being a Stalinist, Althusser lacked direct political orientation. I don't know if that's true. Throughout the 1960s, his theoretical anti-humanism remained a scholastic enterprise of reinterpreting Marx's text, calling for an extreme separation of theoretical practice and political practice, and suggesting, if anything, a political struggle within the Communist Party between the functionaries and the intellectuals. The political import of Althusserianism worked to assert the autonomy of the Communist Party intellectual against the dominance of the politicians, the same principle that Sartre had advocated since 1946. To Althusser, dialectical materialism was not a set of laws derived from nature, but a philosophical enterprise and autonomous theoretical practice. Unlike Sartre, he turned to Marx's Capital to examine Marx's theoretical practice. Borrowing aspects of Gaston Bachelard's concept of an epistemological break, Althusser claimed that in Capital, the book, Marx established historical materialism as a science, but that he did not conceptualize the epistemological novelty of his advance. This was the, quote, absence in Marx's text that Althusser's reading would discover. I think that's what's referred to as, like, in Althusserian jargon, as, like, the symptomatic reading. Of, like, reading, like, what is not there. The goal of Althusser's thought was to redefine dialectical materialism, or the, quote, philosophy of Marxism, a task first articulated by the Existential Marxists. This striking resemblance and problematics between the structural and existential Marxism put their animosity in a different light. His new Marxist epistemology opposed what Althusser termed, quote, empiricism, especially in its historical variant. The vital distinction, obscured by empiricism, between the object of thought and the real object had to be guarded scrupulously. Ideas did not commingle with the objects they sought to represent. Marxist science had to strain to generate concepts, knowledge objects, that enabled society and history to be known. Althusser's thought was here strongly neo-Kantian. Concepts actively created by thinkers were the preconditions for the knowledge of any experience. The strength of scientific Marxism for Althusser was that at the moment of the production of concepts, the scientist was disinterested, beyond all attachment to or interest in the objects of the social world. To Althusser, ideologies were those theories that failed to observe this distinction. Both empiricism and humanism were ideologies, since empiricism conflated theoretical objects with real objects, and the latter erased the distinction between theory and practice. For Althusser, Hegel, the young Marx, Lukacs, Gramsci, and Sartre were all guilty of some form of ideology. In the recent debate between official Marxists and humanist Marxists, Althusser found both camps in error. Neither could account theoretically for the crucial difference between the political economy of the bourgeoisie and the socialism of the proletariat. Marxist epistemology had floundered on the problem of accounting for its own thought as a theory that was qualitatively distinct from past ideologies. For official Marxists, theory merely, quote, reflected the economic position of the thinker, rendering all theories equally ideological, since truth was reduced to the social interest of the theorist. The humanists, for Althusser, did not overcome this difficulty. Lukacs, for example, replied to the reflection theory that the truth value of Marxism derived from the unique position of the proletariat in society, through which it alone could grasp the totality. The proletariat's knowledge was therefore universal, as distinct from the particular knowledge of the bourgeoisie. Yet to Althusser, Lukacs' position was just as ideological as his opponents, since thought was still dependent on social interest. Hence Lukacs was a historicist, who was more concerned with socialism than with establishing a scientific social theory. It should be noted that Sartre's position was closer to Althusser's than was Lukacs', because for Sartre dialectics had an independent truth value to the degree that it made the social field intelligible, not simply because it led to revolution. But Althusser did not carefully discriminate among his enemies. To the structural Marxist, the criterion of ideology was clear, quote, indeed, it is a peculiarity of every ideological conception, that it is governed by, quote, interest beyond the necessity of knowledge alone, end quote. Marx. Excuse me. I don't know. Sorry, I don't know why I said Marx. Althusser. Religious, ethical, and political interests had to be abandoned if thought was to become scientific. Ideologies merely expressed the relation of the, quote, lived experience of men to their world, end quote, and were without scientific value. Althusser's dangerous conclusion was that human interests and scientific interests were completely separate and perhaps opposed. Logically, his revised philosophy of Marxism had to be totally divorced from any leaning towards socialism. Science could have nothing to do with revolutionary action. It was apparent that Althusser's definition of ideology was in some ways in contradiction with Marx's. For Marx, ideology was a false representation of man in the world because ideology took the given situation as natural, dehistoricizing and thereby mystifying the present social formation. In relation to society, ideologies were part of the superstructure, serving to reinforce the substructure. Ideologies were theories that legitimated economic and social relations, and hence were weapons of class rule. Marx did not criticize theories as ideological because they fostered certain human interests, but because they solidified class society. To Marx, the theory of the proletariat delegitimated existing class rule, and hence was different from ideology. This difference, to Althusser, was not enough to establish Marxism as a science. What made Marxism a science for Althusser was not that it led to revolution, but that it did not conceptualize society from the point of view or from the situated presence of any of its members. The theoretical advance of Marx came from the purely theoretical production of concepts that revealed the hidden structure of capitalism. On purely theoretical grounds, Althusser presented, as Marx had failed to do, a theory that showed why Marxism was a science. To the Marxist humanist, however, Marx was able to advance his theory of capitalism only on his prior commitment to the working class. Once he turned the point of view of the working class, he was able to theorize the social formation without the errors of ideology. In the 1844 Manuscripts, they argued, Marx advanced towards socialism only through an anthropological conception of man's reappropriation of his powers that were lost under capitalism. None of Marx's later works were intelligible except through this early commitment. From this point of view, Althusser's distinction between science and ideology threw out the baby with the bathwater. In order to defend the autonomous power of theory, the vital link between theory and practice was cut. Before carrying the debate between Althusser and the humanist Marxists further, we must look at the structuralist reading of Marx's Capital. In the collective work, the book Reading Capital, Althusserian structuralism presented an attitude of scientific indifference toward its object. Due to the peculiar mode of presence of the social object, it could be known only through the scientific attitude. For example, in the book Reading Capital, Rancière argued that Marx's analysis of the commodity switched from an anthropological method that grasped it as created by the labor subject to a structuralist method that grasped the commodity as an illusory appearance that concealed its structure. Rancière quoted Marx, quote, "Value does not carry what is written on its forehead." What it is written on its forehead. End quote. Marx. Value, the sensuous activity of the laborer embodied in the commodity, was absent in the appearance of the commodity in the market. Hence, if we view the commodity from the worker's perspective and interest, we fail to attain any knowledge of its structure. Only if we detach the commodity from any, quote, constitutive subject, end quote, can we overcome systematic, quote, misrecognition. Therefore, scientific Marxism had to be limited to Marx's mature writings, where Feuerbachian anthropology and Hegelian historicism were allegedly eliminated. In capitalist society, labor was, quote, represented in the commodity as value, except that this value was not manifest in the commodity phenomenon. The real, quote, cause of the existence of the commodity on the market was not present but absent in its appearance. It was systematically hidden by the structural processes of circulation. No knowledge could be gained from a phenomenology of the worker, the industrialist, or the merchant, because they viewed the commodity from the perspective of their own interests. Since we were looking for a, quote, absent cause, or a, quote, hidden structure, we had to adopt, as Marx did, scientific structuralism. In Rancière's words, quote, "We are no longer concerned with a text, with a text calling for a reading which will give its underlying meaning, but with a hieroglyph which has to be deciphered. This deciphering is the work of science. The structure which excludes the possibility of critical reading is the structure which opens the dimension of science." End quote. Rancière's decipherment rendered the structure of the economy intelligible, not in its inertness, but in its articulated complexity. Against Sartre's view of the practico-inert as an almost unintelligible mechanism, the structuralist revealed its opaqueness to the social subject and lucidly exposed the degree to which it was impossible for the subject to transform the structure. Further achievements of structuralist Marxism came in works devoted to specific structures, like Nikos Palantzas's Pouvoir politique et classe sociale, which I think is political power and social class, and social classes, of 1971, and Althusser's study of ideology. In the latter work, Althusser went so far as to abandon Marx's distinction between base and superstructure. The state, traditionally viewed as a mere superstructure, maintained an ideological apparatus, in addition to its coercive power and its bureaucracy, which was central to the socialization of workers. For Marx, ideologies were mere illusions, but for Althusser, ideologies, with a history of their own, were a systematic element of every society and would have to be combated independently, in the same way that the bourgeoisie had fought the church. These ideological state apparatuses, functioning in diverse locations, like the church, the family, the schools, and the media, were at the present conjuncture a central target for political activity. Althusser, like Lefebvre and Sartre, rejecting exclusive concern with the economy. However, Althusser's lucid analysis of ideological apparatuses came only after 1968, when the action of the students against the university put its sinister functions on glaring public display. Still, the rigor and penetration of Althusser's method exceeded the capability of Sartre's concept of the practico-inert in articulating unconscious structures. However, the scientific epistemology that made the knowledge possible also cut it off from effective praxis. Marx's injunctions against merely interpreting the world came back to the structuralist as the, quote, absent cause, unquote, of their own theory. The science of the unconscious would have to be joined with an historical anthropology that conceptualized the subjects who were to act upon the knowledge. In Sartre's terms, knowledge of the anti-dialectic or analytical reason would have to be inserted into dialectical reason. Structural Marxism legitimately grasped the structure in itself, more precisely, structure for science, but the structures in their absence have a level of existence for their, quote, bearers, for the people who inhabit them. Part of the structure of the structure is its existence for the subject. These subjects constitute the structures, but not fully consciously, since they are also constituted by the structures. The unconsciousness of structure could be known from the subject side through categories like alienation and bad faith. To save structuralism from reifying the concept of structure, one would have to combine it with Sartre's dialectical reason and then situate the observer in his own world. Althusser's original escape from ideology into science can be only a provisory, temporary procedure for the constitution of the scientific subject, valid for limited kinds of study. In the end, the scientific subject must erase his own bracketing, must re-bridge his own epistemological coupure, and return from withdrawal to the full reality of his subjectivity, acknowledging that the place of return is not a heaven of absolute transparency. In sum, the controversy over structuralism solidified for the French the final lack of a Hegelian absolute subject, forcing the recognition of a duality, or even a multiplicity of partial subjects, one scientific, one existential, whose unity in the present situation could be found, if at all, only in action. Such a decentered multiple subject was the vision of the argument group, with its concept of, quote, fragmentary thought, unquote. It probably goes back to Nietzsche. The death of God must proceed through the dissolution of man, God's object, to arrive at the birth of men and women. Having provided dialectical materialism with an epistemology, Althusser turned to the problem of historical materialism. The topic will be treated under three headings. 1. The division of Marx's text into the Hegelian and scientific. 2. The structuralist definition of the concepts of totality and contradiction. And 3. The structuralist concept of history. Althusser's wrath fell on those who relied on the 1844 manuscripts to present a Hegelian Marxism burdened with humanism, historicism, anthropologism, and empiricism. Against all evidence to the contrary, Althusser maintained that there was a, quote, break in Marx's thought by which Marx totally rejected his youthful concern with man and located a new object for knowledge, the mode of production. With this, quote, immense theoretical revolution, end quote, Marx founded the science of history. Logically, all of Marx's writings before the rupture, which occurred in 1845 and was fully developed after 1857, were fruitless. The persistence of Marx's early concerns in the Grundrisse of 1857 to 1858, and even into Marx's Capital, eventually compelled Althusser to retract his absolute division and restrict the, quote, true Marx even further to the Gotha program and to the obscure marginal notes on Wagner. Quote, when Capital Volume 1 appeared, 1867, traces of the Hegelian influence still remained. Only later did they disappear completely. The critique of the Gotha program, as well as the marginal notes on Wagner's Lehrbuch der politischen Ökonomie, are totally and definitively exempt from any trace of Hegelian influence, end quote. Althusser. One anti-Althusserian wit, Francois Georges, surmised that Marx must have remained young almost until the end of his life. There was clearly, as Althusser maintained, a change in Marx's writings when he studied capitalism closely as a fixed system. Yet this absolute rejection of certain texts seems more tendentious than realistic. It would at least be better to say that Marx complemented the earlier dialectic of alienation with a later structuralist analysis, without being able to resolve the differences between the two approaches. Allowing the opposite tendencies in Marx's text to emerge without imposing a false unity on them is actually more in keeping with structuralist principles of interpretation than Althusser's bifurcation. A more serious contribution by Althusser came with his critique of the Hegelian concepts of totality and contradiction. Before Hegel, social causation was seen mechanically, with isolated elements at one point in society affecting isolated elements at another point. Dissatisfied with this, Hegel accounted for the effects of the totality on each element, but he did so, Althusser warned, by reducing the totality to an essence that was, quote, expressed in every level, as in the book The Philosophy of History, where the world spirit permeated whole civilizations. It is not clear to me, however, that Hegel did this in the phenomenology of spirit, which is the main interest of the existential Marxists. In Althusser's opinion, Marx rejected Hegel's concept of totality and arrived at, quote, a, quote, structuralist concept in which the priority of the totality over the elements was kept and the relative autonomy of each level was asserted. Hegel's concept of contradiction was in similar need of revision. Contradiction was the inner motor of history, the source of tension that led to change. In Althusser's view, Hegel had misplaced the concept of contradiction by associating it with the idea. Ultimately, the cause of contradictions in society was the failure of men to realize the idea. This left Hegel with an idealist notion of causation. For Marx, however, causation was fixed within structures as their interiority. Effect and cause were not distinct but inseparable aspects of the presence of structures. In Althusser's view of Marx, quote, the effects are not outside the structure, are not a pre-existing object, element, or space in which the structure arrives to imprint its mark. On the contrary, the whole existence of the structure consists of its effects. The whole existence of the structure consists of its effects. In short, the structure, which is merely a specific combination of its peculiar elements, is nothing outside its effects. End quote. Marx. Althusser. Following closely the concept of structure in Levi-Strauss, Althusser demonstrated that a contradiction within a structure could not be located exclusively at one level, for instance the economic, but that it was compounded by contradictions specific to every other level of the structure, and was hence, quote, overdetermined. More lucidly than the argument group, Althusser specified the differential effects of each qualitatively distinct level. To Althusser, however, Levi-Strauss's concept of structure was finally inadequate, because it regarded each level as equal in force, whereas Marxists had to account for the dominance of the economy. For this purpose, Althusser spun out a distinction between the, quote, determination in the last instance, unquote, of the economy, and, quote, the dominant role, unquote, of any level at a given conjuncture. This distinction was included to account for the, quote, dominance of kinship in primitive society and of politics in feudal Europe. In order to reproduce itself as a structure, feudalism had to use political means to ensure economic activity. In feudal society, politics was visibly the dominant structure. Yet the dominant role of politics was possible only because, in the final analysis, work had to be done. The economic level was the, quote, absent cause of the dominant role of politics. In other words, the structural effects of the economy were present through their absence. By redefining the nature of contradiction in totality, Althusser transformed the dialectical method into a structural method. All that was preserved of dialectics was the primacy of the whole over the parts and a focus on the relations of the parts. Gone from the Hegelian dialectic was the intelligibility of the signified and the role of men in the process of negation. Structures were now totally objective and men were merely its bearers. The, quote, ahumanity, end quote, of structures defied bourgeois common sense in which, for example, the individual labored to make money and to spend it. If we look at the structure as a whole, to define its rules of operation, money actually used man to maintain money self, not the reverse. Human intentions, in this case self-interest, were present but structurally of secondary importance. Money operated as a system in expansion or contraction through well-defined rules, rules that were obscure from the perspective of a person in search of gain. Althusser's concept of men as bearers of structures made the structures intelligible, but de-emphasized the role of man in changing the structures. As a total theory of society, Marxism proposed to explain history without resort to human agents. We must now turn to Althusser's theory of history. It must be stressed that in the structuralist controversy, the concept of historicism had a specific meaning. To structuralist historical research places man as an active subject, affecting reality through projects that have meaning even though they might lead to unintended results. Denying this assumption, Althusser underlined Marx's achievement as the understanding of capitalism as, quote, processes without subjects, end quote. Althusser. If history dealt with structures, it could no longer view change as linear and homogeneous. In its present evolutionist form, history systematically over-centered the social field by locating meaning in the subject as a, quote, absolute reference, end quote. Althusser. No, it's actually Sabag. I don't know. Anyway, given the concepts of structural contradiction, it was plain that concepts of history as homogeneous continuous succession would be inadequate. On the contrary, to Althusser, each level of the structure had its own temporality and its own history. Multitemporality was not to imply pluralism, because the whole was bound together through the, quote, structure and dominance, end quote. Historians had to be reminded that their habit of periodizing was a theoretical practice that was distinct from the flow of events. Historians produced temporality, and that production would be scientific only if it demarcated the diachrony of structures, not the intentional acts of individuals or groups. In the history of structures, discontinuity and differential temporality prevailed. From the structuralist perspective, Sartre's critique of dialectical reason was a stunning case of historicism. Sartre could never articulate the structure of the pratico inert because it was referred back for its intelligibility to the social agent who constituted it. On the contrary, the unity of social structure, its systematic coherence, went beyond the agent's totalization. For Althusser, Sartre's concept of the pratico inert led to voluntarism. Sartre reduced structures too quickly to the historical action of totalizing individuals without capturing the interior complexity and intricate play of structural unity. But Althusser went too far if he meant that Sartre was guilty of speculative historicism. For Sartre did not reduce the structure to a Hegelian externalization of the idea. Further, Sartre's historical subjects were not contemplative but active, already immersed in the pratico inert. And, unlike Lukacs, Sartre's theory was not absorbed in a subject-object reconciliation. By lumping Sartre with all other Hegelian Marxists, Althusser missed the crucial distinction. Sartre's historicism did not preclude structural analysis and was open for revision in that direction. Footnote. My argument that structuralism must be understood as complementary to existential Marxism is not, hopefully, eclecticism. The foremost critic of structuralism, Jacques Derrida, a philosopher at the École Normale, has repeatedly taken the position that structuralism cannot speak out against the metaphysical nature of philosophies of consciousness without taking into account the rebounding influences of the rejected doctrine on itself. By defining itself against philosophies of consciousness, structuralism inevitably shapes itself in relation to those philosophies and can never succeed in simply surpassing them. In Derrida's words, quote, "The paradox is that the metaphysical reduction of the sign needed the opposition it was reducing. The opposition is part of the system, along with the reduction." From the piece Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, in the book The Structuralist Controversy, Derrida's statement reminds the structuralists of their dialectical dependence on a phenomenological metaphysics of subjective meaning. The intelligibility of the signifier appears only in relation to the doctrine of the intelligibility of the signified. Yet Derrida appears to regard this unconsciousness within structuralism as an unwanted situation that can be done away with, whereas it is my position that the dependence of structuralism on existential Marxism or other philosophies of the subject is necessary and desirable. The structuralist reduction of the field of the intelligible to the signifier would so impoverish the human sciences that the project of doing structuralism would recede into the absurd. It is only against the philosophy of the subject, and as a necessary corrective to it, that the project of structuralism takes on significance. That is why structuralism can never escape existential Marxism, and that is why structuralism can fulfill its possibilities within the human sciences only by deliberately embracing its antithesis in a relation of attraction-repulsion. The meaning appropriated by philosophies of consciousness is over-rich and must be thinned out or decentered by structuralism. By the same token, structuralism must refer itself to existential Marxism as the other of its project. It is in the sense of this double movement that I see the possibility of reciprocity between the two positions. End footnote. In his polemic against historicism and humanism in the 1960s, Althusser never confronted Sartre directly. When he finally did so in 1972, the results were not all that impressive. Not at all impressive. Sartre was dismissed as a humanist and an idealist, a bourgeois philosopher of freedom, a, quote, pre-Marxist, pre-Freudian ideologue, end quote, who made the mistake of believing that history is made by man. This effort by Althusser to criticize Sartre's existential Marxism confronts only the Sartre of the book Being and Nothingness and not the Sartre of Critique of Dialectical Reason. Even then, Althusser's arguments do not have the weight of the early objections by Lefebvre, Mugin, and Lukacs. For their own concept of history, the structuralists formalize what they regard as Marx's achievement in Marx's Capital. Taking over for Althusser, Balibar was left with the Herculean task of presenting Marx as a structural historian. Balibar asserted that in Marx's Capital, Marx produced a table of invariant elements in the means of production, thereby avoiding historicism. In this, quote, combination, there were three elements: workers' means of production and non-laboring appropriators, and two rules of combination: property connection and appropriation connection. The combination presented the economic structure of any society. It differed from the equally atemporal, quote, combinatory of Levi-Strauss, which indicated that the, quote, places of the factors and their relations change, but not their nature, end quote. Balibar. We will leave aside the problem of the alleged universality of Balibar's concept of combination. What is important is that Balibar defined his concept of history as changes in the combination. Structural change consisted not in the dissolution of one structure and the constitution ex nihilo of a new one, but in the, quote, transformation of one structure into another, end quote. The rules of transformation followed Freud's concept of the process of displacement, in which one element takes the place of another, even though the former has no logical connection with the latter. In the formation of capitalism, for example, structural change meant a displacement within the means of production, but the, quote, object of labor, the product, and the, quote, means of labor, the tools, were, quote, separated from the labor in two ways. In the property relation, the worker owned nothing. In the appropriation relation, the worker lost the skills to make the product. In each of the relations of the worker to the means of production, there was a homology of separation that was unique to capitalism. Capitalism thus began with the introduction of the, quote, machine tool, end quote. Since from that point on, all structures were adjusted to the new combination. The worker was separated both from the product and from the tool. The process occurred without a subject, without anyone willing the new combination. Also, capitalism arose out of the structural contradictions of the previous transitional form, manufacturing. The recombination of the same elements took the form of a displacement. More precisely, within the manufacturing or handicraft system, a unity existed between the tools and the worker, whereas under fully developed capitalism, the place of the unity shifted to the relation between the product and the tools. Under industrial capitalism, the tool was structured to produce the product. Under earlier methods, the tool was structured to the human body. Capitalism maximized the separation of the worker and the means of production, not simply by private ownership of property, but also by the use of machines, which maximized output, disregarding the structure of the body or the mind of the worker. Contradiction plagued the new structure, since its effects were both stabilizing and disruptive. The more absolute the separation between the worker and the means of production, the more perfect became the structure and the closer it came to dissolution. In this way, structural history traced displacements in the combination without reference to human action. In detail, the process of change went as follows. Structures were formed out of bits of existing structures. The dissolution of a structure, like feudalism, took place without apocalyptic drama. The structure was simply less able to integrate its subordinate levels, which floated, so to speak, in the social field. The loose elements gradually combined through a process of bricolage, a concept developed by Levi-Strauss. The bricolage, which had no human bricoleur, assembled sections from the junk heap of the previous structure, like a tinkerer in his workshop filled with used remnants. Gradually, but discontinuously, a new structure emerged containing contradictions or imperfections, since it was not designed ahead of time by a perfect planner using appropriate materials and proceeding systematically, but rather through fits and starts with materials suited for a different social machine. To Balibar, Marx's description of primitive accumulation of capital fit the structuralist mode of history. Hence, since the science of historical materialism could demonstrate apodictically that capitalism could not endure forever, it was not a frictionless machine. Moreover, its contradictions led to a combination in which the means of production would be socialized, uniting the separated workers with their tools and their products. Yet if Althusser's claim for the universality of his model is taken seriously, it is hard to see what would become of the appropriators, the third element under socialism. In Althusser's concept of history, as we have seen, social change came about regardless of the deliberate action of human groups. And so, cosmic fatalism crept into Althusser's anti-humanism. All actions seem futile both because structures move autonomously and because practice is always inspired by ideological interests which distort it. Conil, writing in Esprit, captured Althusser's vision by relating it to the change from the post-war era to a technological world. Quote, "No doubt, we can measure here the contemporary malaise, our malaise, the existential anguish born from the war. In the night of the occupation, it is no longer apparent. It is muted by a huge stupor before the fullness of our knowledge and our unlimited powers. This knowledge surrounds us completely. It penetrates us to our deepest intimacy. It is our mode of being and doing, our ineluctable presence in the world. Nothing can escape it, and declamations against science are merely laughable hypocrisy." End quote. And that's from my a piece from Esprit. Can't really see the year, maybe 1967. I'm not sure. Unfortunately, this page is kind of fucked up, so we'll see if I can get through it. In the mad, chaotic human world, praxis was always infiltrated by ideology. Since men always took the point of view of the human species or some part of it, they were always practicing humanists, measuring the world by their own image and desire. Conversely, to the structuralist, social change is a matter of structures and complex systems of innate autonomy and interdependence that was beyond human will. Althusser thus avoided any hint of, quote, anthropology. Yet, even he was caught in the ontological web of being human, and his discourse projected a, quote, interest inherent in all discourse, one that was not purely scientific. This is to read Althusser first, and then to accept the logically necessary truths of Althusser's discourse as in any communication. One could claim that discourse was a system like all others, and therefore that it did not depend on subjects who were only its bearers, as in Levi-Strauss's position, where myths were thought through men. The resort was not open to Althusser. This resort was not open to Althusser because his concept of the epistemological break maintained that scientific discourse, unlike ideology, did not depend on unconscious infrastructures. Science is not decentered, and therefore it did require subjects, constituting creators like Karl Marx, who deliberately produced knowledge. If science rested on subjects, it reintroduced an element of anthropology, and with it the, quote, ideological imperative to read Althusser. Even structuralist history at some point was compelled to utter the word, quote, man. From a Sartrean viewpoint, Althusser's discourse was characterized by a refusal to accept the risk of finitude, that is, the dependence of science on action by the scientist. The existential commitments of the scientist were, quote, structurally an element of his theoretical practice. The Hegel controversy had proved, at least, that science must accept its involvement in history and therefore its incompleteness. Anthropology could not be totally eliminated from science. Human interest, as Habermas argued in the book Knowledge and Human Interest, were not separable from scientific ones. The absoluteness of Althusser's position and his polemical style necessitate defining the limits of his achievements. His radical denial of the intelligibility of the subject led him into a cul-de-sac where the concept of praxis was lost. Because he called into question all doctrines of praxis, it was not enough to say that he had not yet dealt with the question himself. The notion of processes without subjects, of history without men, could be accepted as no more than a partial truth. The impact of Althusser and structuralism turned attention away from existential Marxism. Students of Marxism flocked to Althusser, somehow finding Maoist inspiration in his teaching. A band of Althusser students, known as the Cercle d'Homme, set themselves up within the UEC, the Communist Student Organization, in 1964. After the party sided with Garaudy and against Althusser, the young structuralist Marxists spoke out openly against the party, and by 1966 they were excluded from it. But holding back his own criticisms, Althusser was able to avoid the censor of the party while it enjoyed the prestige of his intellectual success. The Communist Party, bathing in Althusser's theoretical sunshine, found itself in the midst of an intellectual renewal. Things were going so well that Tel Quel, an avant-garde literary journal, associated itself with the Communist Party in the late 1960s, aping the Surrealists of the 1920s and 30s and the Existentialists of the 1940s and 1950s. There's a footnote that I missed. Philippe Soler, in the book Sur le Materialisme of 1974, notes the similarity of Mao's concept of the dialectic in the book On Contradiction with that of Althusser. They are both anti-Hegelian concepts that do not reduce the dialectic to a, quote, original organic totality, end quote, and footnote. The theoretical organs of the Communist Party hummed with excitement and sales steadily rose after 1968. Whether the increased subscription to Les Pensées and La Nouvelle Critique were due to Althusser, as has been suggested, or the events of May 1968, or even to the growing independence of the Communist Party from Moscow, was not at all clear. By the early 1970s, however, the intellectual force of structuralism began to abate. Althusser's project seemed to have run its course, and students no longer rushed so quickly to his classes. Generally speaking, structuralism had become more of a middle-brow fashion than an intellectually heuristic theory. In fact, for the moment, the future direction of French social theory seems uncertain and impossible to predict. After 3 decades of intense theoretical ferment, a moment of relative quiet has emerged. In some places, however, one can detect efforts to combine existential Marxism and structuralism in the manner suggested in this chapter. Footnote. I'm specifically thinking of Jean Baudrillard in the book Le Système des Objects in 1968, Pour une critique de l'économie politique du sein, 1972, and La Milieu de la Production, 1973. Baudrillard uses Lefebvre's concept of daily life and carries further his critique of language, employing a structuralist kind of binary opposition with a Sartrean phenomenology to show the new importance of consumerism, its active quality, and the autonomy of the language code connected with consumer objects. See also Jeremy Shapiro's article titled One-Dimensionality, the Universal Semiotic of Technological Experience, in the book by Paul Blinus titled Critical Interruptions. And footnote. Okay, and that is the end of chapter 8 of Existential Marxism in Postwar France, from Sartre to Althusser, by Mark Poster. Chapter 8 was titled Existential Marxism and Structuralism, with the headings Sartre and Structuralism and the heading Althusser's Revolution Without Rebels. Althusser's Revolution Without Rebels. The next chapter, chapter 9, is titled Epilogue, Intellectualism, May 1968, with the headings Post-Industrial Society and the New Working Class, From the Spectacle to the Festival, and Sartre and Lefebvre explain history. Thank you so much for listening.